January 2016. I can name the hour, late afternoon. The light in the kitchen leaned along the counter at an angle that softened corners, the kind of winter light that makes everything look forgiven. It fell across my mother's hands as she folded dish towels, 3 folds, precise and automatic. So familiar it felt ritual. On the counter sat a small pile of church bulletins, a dish of coupons, and the ordinary objects that had defined the rhythm of her days. It was the sort of domestic geography that teaches you how the world will behave. I will never forget the way she looked up when I spoke, as if I were an unexpected visitor in a house she knew every inch of. January 2016 was a moment when a country was learning new, painful vocabularies for old harms. The Boston Globe Spotlight series in January 2002 had first opened a national conversation about institutional secrecy and clerical abuse. By 2016 that conversation had broadened and accumulated layers. Lawyers and journalists, survivors and advocates, so that the phrase institutional accountability had a different climate around it. In the larger arc of public memory, revelations that had once been isolated and suppressed were becoming connective tissue, things people could reference to make meaning. Later, in October 2017, the #MeToo movement would join those earlier revelations and transform private complaint into public witness. We lived those larger timelines in miniature. Our town did not move at the cadence of national headlines. Small places rarely do, but the currents arrived here, too. Parish council agendas that once glided along now had empty chairs, school board hearings that ran long because parents wanted to know whether the institutions that touched their children were prepared to protect them. The shockwaves of a national reckoning came to rest on our porches, in our kitchens, and across the lunch counters where neighbors exchanged tentative speculations. Sitting across from my mother in that late winter light, I tried a language I hoped would not feel like accusation. People can hold multiple truths, I said. It was less a sermon than an epistemological claim. Someone's kindness in one moment does not cancel the harm they caused in another. I spoke of memory as a map, roads and intersections, parallel routes and dead ends, because maps can help people see paths they might not have known existed. She listened, fitfully, her face shifting between apology, confusion, and a stubborn refusal that looked like defense. On some afternoons she would answer with something like assent, "I suppose nobody is only one thing." On other days she would retreat into the certainty of the life she had built, smoothing the paper of a Bible between her fingers and turning back into the image she had always trusted. Those conversations, January through April 2016, were quiet and sharp, one small heartbreak after another. She catalogued his public goodness as if each item were a talisman: soup kitchen nights, the work on the church steps after the nor'easter in the winter of 1998, when neighbors recalled him organizing chains of people shoveling and hauling, the story of him up on a neighbor's roof in a storm, hands steady as he braced himself against wind. Those facts were true. They were real contributions to our community and to many people's lives. My argument never sought the erasure of those truths. What I wanted, what I still want, was for those memories to live beside the other, darker truths, not to be used as an armor against them. To hold both was an unthinkable rearrangement of the household's furniture. Spring 2016, sorting a house and finding artifacts. May-July 2016. In May 2016 my mother and I began to sort, in the most literal sense, a life. This work was not symbolic only, it was concrete labor, touching paper, folding clothes, making decisions about what would be boxed, what would be handed to neighbors, what would be stored. The town's lilacs were extravagantly purple that spring, evenings stretched later. The house felt dense with memory the way an attic is always dense with the smell of old paper and dust and sunlight trapped in fabric. At the bottom of a desk drawer we had never thought to open, I found a season of theater tickets, time-stamped, October 2006, March 2007. There was my father's fountain pen he used to hold while doing the New York Times crossword puzzle, a coffee-stained shopping list in his looping script with a single entry, milk, and gloves softened by gardening. These objects were not evidence in a legal sense, and still they were everything, proof of an ordinary attentiveness that had been part of our days. Packing them was moral triage. I made a box labeled store, for ordinary memories we could preserve. I set aside tools and gloves to give to neighbors who loved to garden and puzzle. One cold night, when the air outside made inhalation hurt, I carried a small bundle of letters and notes to the backyard and burned them. The fire was not a ritual of vengeance, it was a private, contained way to make room. That summer, gossip in our town began to circulate in the spaces between action and explanation. Someone noted the frequency of my visits to the parish office, someone else had seen me with a lawyer. Rumor moved in kitchens and on porches, whispered questions about tainted donations, speculation about an improper rewriting of a man's public legacy. The private labor of sorting the house, the boxing, the burning, the decisions about which memories to protect, was small and intimate but carried enormous complexity. It shaped how we survived the days, even if it was not the kind of proof one files in court. The public, official machinery began to turn more noticeably in mid-2016. The police began taking statements in early 2016 after several survivors came forward. That process was necessarily cautious and slow. Investigations in small towns are bound by the same legal constraints that govern larger places. Statutes of limitation complicate criminal prosecution, and the uneven availability of forensic evidence and the weight of memory often limit what law enforcement can do. The result in our case was stark and ugly in its practicality. Criminal prosecution would not proceed. That was a fact we learned to live with. Not denial of harm but recognition of the law's limits, and the difficult trade-off that freedom from legal constraint can sometimes mean freedom from legal remedy. Estate Matters and a New Language, July, December 2016, mediation February 2017. My father died in July 2016. His death was sudden. Not a dramatic fall from public favor but a stoppage. A man who had been consistently present in small ways simply stopped showing up. The funeral, later that month, followed the rituals of a town like ours. Flowers, eulogies, recollections of service. There were long silences, too, gaps of air between words, that felt like stones in a shallow riverbed. Friends came not only to grieve but to hold certain stories in place, as if community memory itself required tending. It was in the heat of that grief and confusion that other practical mechanisms moved toward resolution: probate rules, estate administration, and the concrete demands of beneficiaries and creditors. With criminal avenues dimmed, civil and probate channels became the landscape for accountability. I retained a lawyer I had known for 2 decades, someone who understood grief but could also translate sorrow into paperwork. The legal work that followed was less dramatic than the headlines. It was stacks of notices, motions filed under fluorescent lights, and hearings in municipal buildings where the public steps echoed and people tried to comprehend how money could be moralized. We filed claims against the estate in the months that followed and issued notices to beneficiaries. There were hearings in late 2016, sessions in November and December, where parish members argued about donor intent and the sanctity of memorial gifts. Some spoke with rancor, others with trembling bewilderment. The air in those rooms was the peculiar mix of civic formality and raw human distress that small-town public life often produces. In mid-February 2017, we entered mediation. The argument we made was straightforward. Funds that were now tainted by revelation should be repurposed to do immediate good, to support survivor services and prevention programs rather than to memorialize a single man without acknowledging the harms he had inflicted. It was, in language both moral and procedural, a request that the community not turn away from the consequence of knowledge. The mediation was exacting. An hour at a time, proposals and counterproposals, the work of translating grief into line items, but after hearings and negotiation the probate judge agreed. By the spring of 2017 a portion of the estate's assets had been redirected into a small endowment for survivor services and prevention efforts. This redirection was a narrow victory, but an important one. The funds supported a counseling stipend that made several therapy sessions accessible to survivors who could not otherwise afford them. A modest grant went to the local school district to implement trauma-informed education for staff. None of this corrected the past. But in the work I had learned that justice is often less a single, sweeping event than a field of stitched-together measures, practical steps that can move communities toward repair. Money is not justice, but in pragmatic terms it amplifies care and builds structures where none existed. It can buy counseling that prevents a child from continuing in harm or fund training that enables a teacher to act. Late 2016 and early 2017 were years of administrative theater in our town. Letters to the local paper attacked me for desecrating memory. Friends and longtime neighbors called, angry or bewildered, while other communications slipped under doors or arrived in private messages. notes from parents who had been waiting for someone to do the bureaucratic, unglamorous work that allowed them to get help. The ledger I began to compile, dates, testimonies, artifacts, was both a moral accounting and a procedural tool. It forced institutions to articulate funding lines, reporting mechanisms, and external oversight. Turning testimony into budgets and policy was tedious and often unsatisfying, but it produced practical changes that could reduce future harm in ways headlines could not. Fall 2017, Structural Work and Public Debate, September-October 2017. By September 2017, the town civic center, our square, the parish hall, the school auditorium, had become an intersection where history and governance met. Nationally, October 2017 would be remembered as the month #MeToo surged into mainstream attention, but locally we had our own timeline. The parish agreed to convene an external review panel after intense discussion. The school board agreed to adopt a formal training program that would change how teachers were expected to respond to disclosures. These institutional decisions required small, stubborn, bureaucratic labor, phone calls, memos, drafts of policy, and long nights poring over model ordinances and best practice white papers. I found myself in rooms I had never anticipated, conference rooms where budget lines were argued like family heirlooms, auditorium stages where I read statements into microphones. I learned to build spreadsheets that married moral urgency with fiscal constraints. I learned to explain calmly why a hotline needed full-time coordination rather than sporadic volunteer coverage, why records should be digitized and maintained under external oversight rather than left in shoeboxes on the desks of long-time staff. It was mundane work, job descriptions, training schedules, grant reports, but it mattered. We drafted a staffing model for the hotline, a part-time coordinator supporting a roster of trained volunteers, mandated supervision, and an on-call counselor list maintained by the community mental health clinic. We argued for stable funding rather than ad hoc donations. A hotline that appears with the seasons is worse than none at all. The trainer we hired for school staff designed sessions with role-playing, case studies, and checklists for immediate steps when a teacher noticed worrying signs. We insisted on annual refreshers and on orientation for all new hires. We required an external evaluation 2 years in to determine what was working and what needed change. Those bureaucratic measures rooted reform in routine. They were far less dramatic than a headline, but were more likely to protect a child. On October 12, 2017, at a packed town meeting, an older woman rose and wept as she described serving soup beside my father and never imagining his secret. A young man stood and thanked us for the counseling stipend that had allowed him to get help. The ledger we kept, meticulous, mundane, was making harm harder to hide. The energy in the room that night was a mixture of grief, anger, and relief. It felt like the acute phase of a long process in which private testimony was finally being met with public steps. 2018 to 2020, therapy, public engagements, and the slow work of repair. The years 2018 through 2020 rearranged my life in both practical and intimate ways. I began to speak publicly, but deliberately. I avoided tokenizing media appearances that sought spectacle without substance. Instead, I accepted invitations where pedagogy and policy intersected, a university panel on mandatory reporting in March 2018, a clergy workshop in June 2019 where local ministers worked through scenarios and reporting checklists, and a library talk in November 2019 where 20 people sat in folding chairs and a woman in her 50s told me she had called a resource number mentioned that night and that the call had led to a child's removal from an unsafe home. That single private success felt like the true currency of the work, not applause, but a changed life. Therapy was central to my survival. Panic attacks began to arrive without warning, on grocery aisles when shopping carts scraped my ankles, in the middle of a meeting when a phrase unstuck memory. So I learned grounding techniques from cognitive behavioral therapy. I later moved into long-term psychodynamic work to trace the patterns that had normalized abuse, the economy of silence, the habits of avoidance that calcified into tradition. My therapist recommended a small practice, 1 hour each week devoted to pleasure without purpose. I took a ceramics class in late 2018. The clay resisted my perfectionism, my bowls were wobbling and imperfect. Working with clay taught me that repair and beauty can coexist with damage. The pressure of my thumb left a fingerprint on a bowl, a small human mark that made the piece real. Romance in those years was tentative. Dating is a negotiation of trust. Mine was a limited currency. I learned to think of dating as boundary work. Not everyone deserved access to the ledger. Some partners accepted my complexity with tenderness. Others left because they could not carry the weight. I began to insist on small gestures, a text to check in, a hand on my back, an acceptance of my nighttime needs, and I judged people by whether they could meet those baseline expectations. Those boundaries were not punitive, they were survival strategies. We pursued civil cases selectively between 2017 and 2018, focused on redirecting funds, implementing policy changes, and insisting on external audits. Litigation is expensive, emotionally draining, and rarely aligns exactly with what survivors need. I advised others to preserve themselves. Survivorship is tactical, not heroic. You choose battles that maintain your life. 2019, The Plaque, Public Memory, and Compromise, February 3, 2019 and subsequent months. Public markers of legacy, benches, a plaque in the small park, a donor list at the church, became contested terrain. Gardeners urged the complete removal of his name. Parishioners argued for some acknowledgement of his public work. After months of meetings, the first formal debate in the parish took place on February 3, 2019. The compromise we reached altered the plaque's language to include a line that invited truth and vigilance. The inscription would acknowledge contributions to the community while explicitly emphasizing the need to guard against abuses of power. We funded an annual lecture on consent and power dynamics from the redirected estate funds, and the parish agreed to an external review every 3 years. The decision pleased no one entirely, but it was honest and avoided reductive gestures, neither erasing the past nor canonizing it. That moment, small and contested, was emblematic of the larger challenge of public memory. How do you commemorate public good without obliterating the public's responsibility to name and address private harm? Our solution was imperfect and pragmatic. It held practical consequences. The annual lecture created a ritual of accountability. The external review created a recurring mechanism to surface and address complaints. It was, in other words, structural memory rather than static monument. 2020 to 2021, the pandemic and sustaining the work, March 2020 onward. The COVID-19 pandemic arrived in March 2020 and, in ways both expected and surprising, altered everything. Town meetings moved online. Reports of domestic and childcare-related harms increased as families faced lockdown isolation. The hotline we had designed was suddenly essential. The part-time coordinator's role expanded into a full-time position for a year as calls surged in spring 2020. Grant funds were reallocated to cover the temporary expansion. Counselors shifted to telehealth. We produced guidance for parents isolated and anxious, and the ledger had to become flexible to meet new realities. The pandemic also created space for quieter domestic repair. My mother and I invented small rituals to keep ordinary life anchored. Folding laundry together in the late afternoon, stacking plastic cups in the old, slightly askew way she preferred, preparing a meal at regular hours. These rituals were not drama, they were armor against the impossibility of what we had learned. When she cried without warning, I handed her a towel because it was the most concrete act I could offer. The towel became a kind of liturgy. Healing was halting and uneven. It took months for my mother's apologies to transform from defensive murmurs into something less equivocal. One day in 2021 she said, "I should have seen it." I did not respond with accusation. I handed her an atlas of practical knowledge, lists of warning signs, concrete steps to take if someone noticed similar patterns elsewhere. Knowledge felt like care, something we could perform together. Those months deepened an awareness that repair is both moral and pedagogical. It requires personal admission and public structural change. 2018 to 2019, Building Civic Structure and the Nonprofit, May 2018 Incorporation, March 2019 501c3. Work at the civic level also matured. We incorporated a small nonprofit in May 2018 to administer the redirected funds and programmatic work. The organization received 501c3 status in March 2019. From those foundations we offered counseling stipends, funded school trainings, and began to develop protocols, checklists for teachers, referral pathways to counselors, reporting forms for administrators. We insisted every training include an external evaluator and that schools report back annually on public metrics. The ledger, my private file and the public summaries we produced, became the nonprofit's operating manual. The private ledger, stored digitally with encryption and physically in a locked binder, was catalogued by date and theme, institutional response, personal memory, and material artifacts. The public summary was an edited, anonymized document used for education. Together they guided funding priorities and program design. The nonprofit's early board meetings were often modest, a handful of residents, 2 teachers, a social worker, and a retired accountant. We debated policy language and the proportion of funds set aside for emergency counseling. Those practical arguments were where theory met the real demands of people in distress. 2022 to 2023, Institutionalizing the Ledger and Public Reckoning, April 10, 2022, September 8, 2023. Progress was incremental and contested. A 5-hour town hall on April 10, 2022, captured the messiness of collective reckoning. Neighbors stood to speak of betrayal, sorrow, disappointment. An older woman said she had served soup beside my father for years and never imagined him capable of harm. A young neighbor thanked us for a counselor stipend that had made help available. These testimonies mattered because they forced complexity into public view. They refused to let the crisis be simplified into a single headline or cleaned into nostalgia. By September 8, 2023, the ledger's influence was visible in municipal policy. At a town council meeting that day, council members voted to fund annual consent lectures with public money and to require external audits for any church that received municipal grants. That vote was neither sweeping nor sensational, but it was architectural, a structural step to make institutional vigilance routine. The ledger had shifted from a private notebook into civic architecture. It became instructive to see how a personal record, careful dates, testimonies, and policy recommendations could be translated into municipal ordinance, budget items, and required audits. The change was small in the scale of municipal governance but large in the lives it could touch. Repair and reparation, small acts, sustained labor. Repair did not come in grand proclamations. Sometimes it arrived as performative gestures, public apologies that did not commit to concrete action. Those I learned to read quickly. More meaningful repair was quiet labor, a neighbor who baked bread without announcing it, a volunteer who spent hours at the community center, a friend who showed up at the right time. I began to evaluate contrition by its inconvenience. Were people willing to do the work when it inconvenienced them? Were they prepared to be accountable in verifiable, sustained ways? Humble, patient labor mattered far more than single, dramatic gestures. Letters arrived with a frequency that denied simple closure. Some accused me of destroying a family. Others thanked me for doing the paperwork that finally allowed parents to get help. In 2022, a principal wrote to say that because of our training, a teacher had noticed changes in a child and intervened early. In 2023, a woman wrote to say the language we taught had allowed her to name grooming and seek help for her son. These letters did not absolve the past. They were evidence that small policy changes could produce large differences in lives. Personal life and private rituals. I developed rituals to steward myself. I kept a notebook with entries that marked days when I felt steady and notes when I fell apart. The notebook was not performative, it was a tool for atmospheric management. If a pattern emerged, certain anniversaries, smells, or songs that triggered a cascade, I could change conditions to protect myself. I scheduled check-ins with friends whose presence felt ordinary rather than forensic. I allowed certain days to be ordinary, a practice of muscle-building ordinariness accumulated over time. Some routines were restorative, the ceramics class, exercises, sanctioned evenings of laughter with friends. Others were administrative, renewing non-profit paperwork, preparing grant narratives, budgeting, responding to requests from foundations for more detailed metrics. I also protected myself by deciding what battles not to fight. Several legal options were closed to me because they were costly and would not materially benefit survivors. I counseled others similarly. Pick fights that preserve yourself. The ledger as public memory and civic tool. The public face of the ledger was clear, anonymized, and pedagogical. It translated testimony into policy prescriptions, how donations might be channeled toward repair and prevention, how schools could adopt reporting procedures, how parishes might commission independent review panels. The private ledger remained confidential, a locked archive of raw testimony for future prevention work. That dual function was essential. It allowed the ledger to be used as an educational tool without exposing survivors to additional harm. On September 8, 2023, when the town council's vote-funded consent lectures and mandated audits for grant recipients, the ledger's civic imprint was visible. It had moved from being personal memory to part of municipal infrastructure. Watching that transition felt, at times, like watching an instrument be handed to an institution. It required translation, training, and the willingness of officials to adopt practices that might feel novel or uncomfortable. Small sustenance and continuing grief. 18 years of abuse leaves a gravity that does not simply dissolve with time. The number, 18 years, hovers in sentences and does not slip away. It is a fact the ledger holds plainly. Time did not heal in any miraculous way, but the edges softened. There were mornings when I did not begin by drafting the events of my childhood and evenings when songs did not crack me open. These changes were not miraculous. They were the sum of many small decisions: therapy, friend calls, a ceramics class, dinners, steady practice. Ordinary kindness, small, repetitive gestures, became essential. A neighbor leaving extra mugs on my doorstep when I ran out of milk, a friend texting a joke at the right moment, a teacher who asked me to translate policy rather than to moralize. These were not cures. They were accretions of care that made standing possible. Anniversaries, once knots of dread, were repurposed. The date of the funeral, which had been a single terrible knot, became a day in which the ledger was opened and a short public statement read, acknowledging harm and recommitting to prevention measures. The ritual was modest and unspectacular, but honest and necessary. These public acknowledgments, carefully limited, factually grounded, and oriented toward prevention, helped stabilize community memory. Limits, imagination, and translation work. Not every survivor chooses the path I did. Many choose quiet avenues of accountability or private therapy. Some prefer to leave loose threads undisturbed. The ledger was my instrument, matched to my capacity and values. It demands stamina and accepts social costs, strained friendships, a mother's disrupted image, a town's disturbed wholeness. The ledger's function is archival and translational. It keeps public summaries for education and private testimonies for prevention. It is organized so patterns are visible: institutional responses, personal recollections, material artifacts. Perhaps the least visible part of the work was translation, turning emotional testimony into policy language a school board could accept and into budget lines a foundation could fund. That work was quiet and endless, answering emails late into the night, preparing referrals to therapists, connecting people to legal aid. It was mundane and indispensable. I also learned to do a different kind of translation, converting the intensity of personal testimony into forms that would not re-traumatize survivors. That meant neutral language where necessary, trigger warnings where appropriate, and always allowing survivors to control the terms of disclosure. The ledger, in this sense, was less a public litany than a carefully edited manual for civic repair. 2024, Modest Victories and Continuing Labor, Spring 2024 Letters and Ongoing. By 2024, the ledger had produced concrete results: a counselor hired for the school district, a hotline with trained staff, an external auditor reviewing a parish's complaint processes. None of these measures erased the past. They did, however, make it more likely that a child would be noticed early and helped. Letters in the spring of 2024 made the labor feel worthwhile. A woman wrote to say that because of our training she had recognized grooming in her granddaughter's life and secured early intervention. A teacher wrote to tell of a student who benefited from a referral prompted by staff training. Small mercies traced a line from policy change to child safety. These letters are thin evidence of impact, but in the aggregate they accumulate into something that looks a lot like prevention. The ledger remained living. I added pages as new testimony arrived and margin notes when policies shifted or grants were awarded. I protected what sustained me: close friends, meaningful work, evenings of laughter, and I continued to insist that public narratives include a full account. I sought not vengeance but truth, the refusal to let the past become a tidy legend that would allow abusers to hide. Every so often I light a candle and open the ledger not to catalogue sorrow but to remind myself of what we have done and what remains. I read aloud entries that record trainings funded, policies adopted, and volunteers who agreed to staff the hotline. There is an astonishment in that practice. The ledger asks for steady labor, not spectacle. It asks us to structure our towns and institutions to minimize hiding and maximize care. Ongoing choices, boundaries, and measurable indicators. Energy is finite. I say no to many invitations because carrying the ledger requires conservation. I say yes to specific, sustained projects. A school board meeting where a policy can change, a clergy workshop that will implement mandatory reporting, a community center training where residents practice intervening. I measure success with short-term, verifiable indicators, a counselor hired, a hotline staffed by trained professionals, an external review policy adopted. At the same time, I model a different ethic. Accountability is not a spectacle, it is communal repair that requires discretion, dignity, and meticulous work. I refuse to let the ledger be reduced to gossip. I hold boundaries with people who would use it for theater. Tenderness arrives in the most practical forms. A woman once wrote to say our funding allowed her to find language and seek help. Letters like that arrive quietly and remind me why the paperwork mattered. They tie a thin, crucial line from small policy changes to a child who is safer. Imagining a future where the ledger is less necessary. In the soft hours before dawn, I imagine a future where the ledger is less necessary. I picture schools that teach boundary language by default, parishes that routinely contract independent reviewers, neighborhoods that respond to suspicion with care rather than reputation defense. The vision is architectural, boring in the best way. It imagines systems that default to protection rather than secrecy, that remove the hidden corners where harm festers. That future is not utopian. It requires funding, patience, repeat administrative labor. It means routine external audits, annual refresher trainings, and stable staffing for hotlines. It requires accessible, safe reporting mechanisms. These are not thrilling prescriptions, but they change life in practical, necessary ways. The ledger will not be finished. New testimonies will arrive, new trainings must be funded, new conversations will need to be had. I will still be asked to speak, and I will refuse many invitations. When I accept, I choose places where pedagogy and practice meet and where change can be measured. Conclusion: holding two truths. When I look at a photograph of my mother and me with the plastic cups, the sun flattening the grain of the picture, I do not see a single story. I see braided truths: love and harm, tenderness and betrayal. Loving someone who has hurt me is not a betrayal of myself. It is a complicated, stubborn fact of life. The ledger helps me hold those truths at once. It keeps the public account honest and preserves the private work of repair. There are nights when sorrow is a flood. I do not hide those moments. Hiding would insult the ledger's honesty. I allow grief to be present and measure progress in small terms. A friend who stayed when others left, a teacher who acted because they were trained, a neighbor who quietly offered help after admitting past failures. Those small changes are the threads that keep me moving forward. The ledger is not a final act. It is an ongoing invitation to deliberate labor, to restructure towns and institutions so that hiding is minimized and care is maximized. It asks us to fund counseling, to train educators, to provide safe reporting mechanisms, to maintain external oversight. When I close the ledger and put it on the shelf, I feel a small, tired satisfaction. The work is not finished, but the ledger records where we have been, what we have accomplished, and what remains. That imperfect human record is enough for now, and perhaps for longer than I expect. When I first wrote the ledger, the act of arranging facts felt like a private surgery. Clean incisions, catalogued evidence, a slow stitching together of events that had been scattered across decades. That private work continued into public life, and on November 2, 2024, it moved into a space I had not intended to occupy, my father's funeral. The date is exact in my memory because I wrote it in the margin of the ledger, next to an entry that began, matter-of-factly, 18 years, physical discipline ending in 2010, and then continued with details I had spent years assembling. The ledger had not been written for a spectacle. It had been written as a civic instrument. What I did on that day was both an extension of the ledger's purpose and a private choice I did not consult my mother about. In the months leading up to November 2, I had done the visible things I always do, meetings with the council that oversaw the municipal archive, phone calls to the parish administrator, calls to a lawyer I trusted who understood confidentiality and statutes of limitation. I had also done the quiet things I had learned to value, nightly practice of the statement I planned to read, a rehearsal in my head that removed melodrama and left only precise language, and a few conversations with a small circle of friends who had supported my ledger without ever asking me to perform it publicly. The church that morning smelled of lilies and lemons. Winter air pressed against the stained glass. The congregation filled the rows. Distant relatives, a few people from town who had known my father in earlier decades, the parish priest, a handful of officials who had come because my family was local. My mother sat near the front with the plastic cups photo folded in her purse. She had come expecting a particular kind of closure, a funeral as ritual, a eulogy that framed a life in conventional terms. She did not know the ledger existed. She did not know, certainly, that I intended to speak. I had not told her. I had not told many people. The ledger's utility depended on steady, calibrated interventions, not sudden performances. Yet there was something that day that demanded a different scale of action. The parish had been one of the institutions in which my father's behavior had been shielded by reputation and sometimes by silence. The rituals that protect a community's external image had left holes, places where children could fall and not be noticed. I had the ledger. I had the civic relationships that could translate testimony into policy. And I had a weary conviction that a ceremony framed as remembrance could also be a moment to insist upon record and reform. I stood after the priest's homily. The room settled into the kind of hush that funerals manufacture, a communal intake of breath. I spoke for 8 minutes. I had written and rewritten every sentence in the ledger's neutral voice. No flourishes that would feed gossip, no dramatic revelations that would re-traumatize other survivors who might be sitting in the room and prefer privacy. I said what I knew to be irrefutable: dates, the nature of harm, the effect on my life, the fact that the parish had received complaints at various points and had not commissioned an independent review. I named systems rather than personalities where possible. I stated that I did not seek to ruin anyone's memory of my father, but that simple remembrance without rigor could be dangerous. It allowed institutions to forget their obligations. I did something else at the end. I placed a sealed envelope on the small table near the altar and addressed it to the parish council and to the municipal archive. The envelope contained a public summary of the ledger, a 2-page, strictly factual account that could be lodged with the parish records and the town clerk. I asked, in writing, for an independent review and for parish leadership to agree to regular external audits within 12 months. The wording was procedural and uninflected by emotion. It used the same language I used when I negotiated with foundations and school boards. It also contained a note, short, private, and explicit, requesting that the congregation be given a public statement that would not accuse individuals but would acknowledge institutional failings and the need for prevention measures. I handed another copy to the municipal archivist who had come that morning, with instructions for the ledger's confidential storage, public summary accessible, raw testimony locked and available only to appointed prevention partners. My mother sat still as the congregation murmured. After the reception, she took me aside with that same bewildered face she had worn in the photographs. Close-lipped, a little embarrassed, trying to maintain composure. "Why?" she asked in that small voice. "He was your father." Her question was not a request for explanation so much as a reproach. How could I bring such a public thing into a grieving family space? I told her what I had rehearsed into the ledger, that the act was not about eroding memory but about ensuring that memory did not facilitate more harm. I told her it was for the children who might come after us and for any other survivor who deserved a system that listened. She did not understand, not then. She accused me later, 2 days after the funeral on November 4th, of embarrassing the family, of taking vengeance on a dead man. She called the police at one point, an old friend of hers, protective in a small-town way, and then apologized, embarrassed by her panic. I did not press her. I also did not retract what I had done. I had expected that she might feel betrayed. The ledger is clear-eyed about the costs of speaking. The ledger is also clear-eyed about the moral arithmetic of prevention. Sometimes the smallest, most procedural steps look like betrayal to those who have built their identities around denial. The immediate civic consequences were slow but measurable. On December 1, 2024, 19 days after the funeral, the parish council formally acknowledged receipt of the envelope and the request for review. It took until January 15, 2025, for the independent review panel to be appointed, 3 external reviewers with experience in abuse prevention and institutional audits. The delay was a pattern I had learned to expect: bureaucratic caution, legal counsel, a kind of procedural hedging. But once the panel convened, its work accelerated. They requested access to the parish complaint log, interviewed staff, and catalogued administrative gaps. Their preliminary report, delivered in April 2025, confirmed patterns the ledger had suggested: inconsistent reporting protocols, blurred lines of authority, and a tendency to resolve accusations informally rather than with transparent, documented processes. I felt a complicated gratitude when that report was published in May 2025. It matched the ledger's summary without sensationalizing. It provided a framework for remedial steps. For the first time, the parish agreed to a series of measures: mandatory refresher training for clergy and staff by September 2025, a public-facing complaints procedure displayed prominently in the parish hall, and an agreement to bring in an external ombudsperson to whom allegations could be reported. The town council, which had seen the ledger's municipal imprint in September 2023 and had watched the councillor and hotline steps take root through 2024, allocated a modest implementation grant in June 2025 to help smaller parishes contract trained auditors when needed. The ledger's public summary being placed in parish and municipal archives made it possible for these changes to be argued in administrative language rather than in anecdote. That was part of its point. Placing facts in civic record created continuity. It allowed future clerks, new parish leaders, and incoming council members to consult an institutional memory rather than rely solely on oral defense or familial reputation. It created the very boring architecture of prevention I had fantasized about in early mornings: policies that default to protection. My mother and I did not reconcile instantly. Grief is a strange solvent. It dissolves some bonds and hardens others. She oscillated between a desire to return to the safe image of her husband and a dawning awareness that I had done something procedural and lasting. We had conversations, careful, sometimes painful, about responsibility and love. In one winter afternoon in February 2025 she said, "I didn't know you would do that at his funeral," with a voice that carried both accusation and curiosity. I said again, that secrecy had been part of the harm and that exposing systems was part of the remedy. She said nothing for a long time. Later she visited the municipal archive with me. She sat across from the archivist, fingers tracing the edge of the public summary, and asked procedural questions: how the records were stored, who could access them, what privacy measures were in place. She listened then, in the way a person listens when the terms are practical rather than moral. There were communal tensions that followed. Some neighbors called me brave, others called me cruel. A distant cousin accused me of desecrating the sanctity of mourning. An elder in the parish wrote a letter to the local paper arguing that sermons of forgiveness should be sufficient. I answered none of those letters publicly. Instead, I forwarded procedural requests to the parish council, recommended language for a public acknowledgement that did not name names but did accept institutional responsibility, and worked through the ledger to connect survivors with legal and therapeutic services when they sought them. By mid-2025, the ledger had taken on a regional function. Requests arrived from 2 neighboring towns, Hardwick and Lanesborough, asking for advice on how to set up similar archival summaries and confidential ledgers. I trained a small team in July 2025 to help other communities translate personal testimony into policy-friendly documents. The team's work was modest and meticulous: secure storage protocols, consent forms that allowed survivors to control disclosure, templates for external audits, and sample budget lines for training and hotlines. We kept the same ethical center: survivors' control over disclosure, factual language for public summaries, and clear pathways from testimony to prevention. There were new victories and setbacks. In August 2025, a foundation awarded a 2-year grant to scale external auditing in small congregations across the county. A local school board adopted a mandatory consent curriculum in September 2025 for grades 6 through 8. Those were wins measured in budgets and curricular guides. The ledger's role was less visible but essential. It had provided a model for turning testimony into administrative instruments. Not every day felt like progress. There were nights when the past reclaimed its force. Dreams returned with the same fury as before, a different kind of archive, one made of sensation rather than records. I still attended therapy, still relied on friends, still practiced saying no. The ledger demanded stamina and precise labor, and I protected my time accordingly. I refused invitations that promised spectacle but not change. I accepted invitations where pedagogy, practice, and measurable outcomes were clear. One of the ledger's most surprising effects was on small civic rituals. Where once funerals and anniversaries were purely private acts of mourning, they began to carry an extra clause, a moment for acknowledgement. On March 21, 2026, the town memorial service included a brief, neutral statement about institutional responsibility and the presence of prevention resources for attendees. The statement was not dramatic, it was a civic footnote. But these footnotes accumulate. They change the texture of community memory. They normalize the idea that remembrance need not whitewash harm. The ledger continues to be private and public in equal measure. Raw testimony remains locked, public summaries are archived and accessible. New cases arrive periodically. Testimonies from adults who were children decades ago, a teacher's account that points to grooming misread as strictness, an older parishioner who remembered a conversation and decided at last to share it. Each arrival requires translation, who to redact, what to summarize, which agencies to notify. Each arrival requires choices about resources, referrals, and the emotional bandwidth necessary to process more grief. Throughout, I maintain small rituals. On the first Monday of each month, I open the ledger not to add new testimony but to review the policy follow-ups, which hotlines received calls, which trainings were scheduled, which audits concluded with corrective plans. That habit began in 2024 and it has continued. It is an accountability practice as much for me as for the institutions, to ensure that the ledger does not become symbolic decoration but remains a functional link between memory and prevention. There are nights when I imagine stepping away entirely, when I picture towns with systems so robust that the ledger is no longer necessary. I catalogue that as a success, not a loss. The ledger's ultimate end would be communal competence, schools that recognize grooming language by default, parishes that automatically commission independent reviewers, neighborhoods that respond with trained intervention rather than rumor. These are mechanical changes, policy manuals, budget lines, continuing education credits. They are not glamorous. They are the plumbing of safety. I do not know how long I will carry the ledger in the same hands. New projects appear, the team that helps nearby towns grows cautiously, funding cycles begin and end. My mother and I navigate an uneven landscape of grief and accountability. She has never used the ledger herself, she still distills much into private loyalties and small acts of kindness. She does not always agree with what I do. She visits sometimes, brings extra mugs of soup, asks procedural questions in moments when she can hear the civic language without feeling personally attacked. What I can say with clarity and with the ledger open on my lap is this: the work continues. The funeral on November 2, 2024, was a pivot point. Not because it dramatized our family's private horror, but because it forced an institution to hold a record and to answer to it. Since then, incremental changes, audits, trainings, a counselor in the district, a hotline staffed and funded, archived public summaries, have altered the environment that once made secrecy easy. There will be more work, new testimonies, more audits, the slow administrative labor of making prevention routine rather than exceptional. The ledger will continue to be both a memory and a manual, an instrument lodged between private pain and public repair, and I will continue the work of translation and protection as long as the town needs it and I am able. The ledger's work did not end with the modest civic footnote on March 21, 2026. That statement had been small by design, a sentence of acknowledgement and a line directing people toward resources, but it set an expectation that official occasions could contain, alongside grief, a factual inventory of institutional responsibility. The months that followed unfolded as a sequence of administrative hardening, meetings, memos, contracts, and the slow accrual of procedural muscle. In April 2026, the parish council implemented the first of the panel's recommendations. An external ombudsperson would be appointed as an intermediary for complaints. The appointment process began with a public call for qualifications posted on April 9, 2026, and concluded on July 1, 2026, when we selected a retired social services director with 15 years' experience in institutional complaints and restorative practices. The ombudsperson's contract was modest, 20 hours a month paid through a combination of the June 2025 municipal grant and private donations raised by a coalition of residents, and it included a clause that required annual, anonymized reporting to the municipal archive. That reporting obligation mattered because it created a predictable, auditable rhythm. Complaints would not disappear into the parish ledger, they would be counted in a public ledger of a different sort. Training cycles continued. The mandatory refresher training, pledged to be in place by September 2025, had occurred on schedule in late September 2025 for the core staff and clergy of the parish. A second round was held in October 2025 for volunteer leaders. By the fall of 2026 we had moved from one-off sessions to an ongoing schedule, quarterly workshops for new staff, an annual review for the vestry, and an online module that clergy could complete on their own time. Evaluations were incorporated, pre- and post-training assessments began in January 2026, and the early data, presented at a town meeting on October 14, 2026, showed modest gains in staff confidence around reporting protocols and an increased willingness to use neutral language in incident notes. These were not dramatic cultural shifts, but they were measurable changes that could be tracked across future ledger reviews. The ledger's translation team, the small group I had trained in July 2025, grew through necessity. In January 2027 we formalized that team into a cooperative, registered as a non-profit on January 18, 2027, with bylaws that enshrine survivor control over disclosure, strict data retention schedules, and a rotating ethics board that included 2 survivors, a municipal archivist, and a legal advisor. The 2-year foundation grant awarded in August 2025 funded much of our early work through August 2027. Knowing that the grant would sunset, we spent the winter of 2026 to 2027 building sustainable revenue streams, municipal contracts, a sliding scale fee for neighboring towns, and a small county appropriation that passed on December 10, 2026, securing funding for a shared auditor position. These moves were bureaucratic but necessary. They prevented the ledger from becoming a one-person project dependent on goodwill. Other towns kept calling. Hardwick formally adopted our model on March 2, 2026, after a 6-week consultation. Lanesborough followed on May 4, 2026. We sent teams to both towns in June and July 2026 to assist with archival procedures and consent forms. The work in Hardwick revealed a particular challenge, a long-standing culture of conflating discipline with moral instruction. A teacher who had reported concerns in 1998 had recently come forward with new reflections. Translating her account into the ledger required months of correspondence to ensure accurate redaction and to establish referral pathways to legal clinics. Lanesborough's parish requested help drafting a public summary that would not sensationalize but would state facts plainly. We created a template that emphasized institutional action rather than lurid detail, and that template has since been adapted in at least 9 other congregations across the county. There were policy ripples beyond parish walls. On September 22, 2026, the county board adopted a policy recommending independent audits for any faith institution receiving municipal funds or tax-advantaged support, with audits to be performed at least every 5 years. The policy stopped short of mandating audits for every congregation. Political and constitutional constraints made that impracticable, but it established a normative pressure. If you wanted public support, you would have to be auditable. The vote was 7-3, and the minutes recorded heated public comment from both survivors and defenders of congregational autonomy. We used the ledger in those hearings as documentary support. Where previously anecdotes had been dismissed as singular complaints, the ledger's summaries offered a pattern, a municipal memory that council members could weigh. The ledger's growing civic footprint produced new forms of resistance. In October 2026, a diocesan administrator wrote a letter arguing that public summaries risked irreparably damaging reputations and community cohesion. The letter precipitated an internal debate within several parishes about confidentiality and the boundaries of public interest. In one case, a parish in the Northern Valley initiated legal counsel to argue for stricter limits on archival access. That suit was settled in mediation on February 11, 2027, with an agreement that set clearer standards for redaction and a process for contested disclosures. Procedural protections that actually strengthened survivors' control in the long run, because they made the entire process less vulnerable to ad hoc, reputationally driven challenges. On a more intimate level, my relationship with my mother evolved in incremental, bureaucratic ways as much as in emotional ones. After that winter afternoon in February 2025 when she asked, "I didn't know you would do that at his funeral," she began to lean into the civic language she understood: procedures, timelines, records. In May 2026 she joined me at a workshop on municipal records access and volunteer training, not as a speaker but to learn how the archive protected sensitive material. She began to volunteer one afternoon a week at the municipal archive in August 2026, primarily folding envelopes and organizing donor receipts, small acts that allowed her to be close to the ledger without being the ledger's author. To the extent that reconciliation required instruments as well as feelings, this was a kind of reconciliation, not forgiveness in the old, cinematic sense, but a negotiated coexistence where she could practice civic competence without having to renegotiate every memory of my father. Survivor support deepened. In March 2027 we convened a survivor advisory panel for the first time, an opt-in group that met monthly to guide how we wrote summaries and which services to highlight. The advisory panel's creation was a direct response to feedback received during the 2026 training cycles. Survivors wanted more say in how their histories were used. The panel insisted on 3 core principles when it convened on March 15, 2027. Never publish identifiable detail without explicit consent, provide immediate confidential referrals when new accounts arrived, and review any public language before it was archived. These principles became codified in our consent forms on April 2, 2027, and they altered our workflow in profound ways. Work that had once been about translating testimony into administrative instruments now required additional steps: survivor review windows, trauma-informed redaction by trained personnel, and secure per-case storage that separated raw testimony from public summary files. There were victories that could be counted and ones that could not. The school board's adoption of a mandatory consent curriculum for grades 6 through 8 in September 2025 was a procedural victory measured in curricular documents and line items in the school budget. The day-to-day effects of that curriculum took longer to assess. In the spring of 2027 we began to collect qualitative reports from counselors and teachers: better language among students for discussing boundaries, more confident adult interventions in playground disputes, and a modest increase in reporting of inappropriate behavior that, in prior years, had been shrugged off as tough love. Those reports did not erase the past, but they suggested the ledger's preventive aims were beginning to alter the lived experience of the town's younger residents. There were setbacks. In late 2026 an arson at a decorative shed behind a parish hall, intent unknown, stung the community and reopened debates about safety and rumor. The arson was not connected to the ledger, but its timing fed a narrative among some residents that outside trouble had come with transparency. Attendance at one midwinter forum in January 2027 was lower than expected. Some active volunteers said they were exhausted, and a few long-term donors paused contributions. We adjusted. Communications became clearer about what the ledger funded: audits, hotlines, training, and what it did not fund: litigation, personal counseling beyond referral. We also instituted a volunteer rotation in February 2027 to prevent burnout, ensuring that the administrative labor did not rest on any single person, including myself. My own life continued in parallel. Therapy remained a steady practice. Weekly sessions transitioned in June 2026 to bi-weekly when caseloads and funding pressures tightened. I continued to use a mix of cognitive and somatic approaches to manage intrusive memories and to hold the ledger's administrative responsibilities with clear boundaries. I dated briefly in the summer of 2026 and then again in the winter of 2027, but I kept those relationships compartmentalized. Friends learned quickly that my schedule included ledger reviews on the first Monday of the month and that those commitments were non-negotiable. The rituals persisted because they were ballast. The ledger was a public device, but it was also a private stabilizer that demanded regular, unemotional attention. There were new institutional developments at the county level. On June 8, 2027, the County Health Department announced a small continuing education stipend for clergy and educators who completed accredited training on abuse prevention. That stipend, which began as a pilot and was available to qualifying personnel until August 31, 2028, was designed to encourage participation and to lower the cost barrier for smaller congregations. The stipend's rollout involved a grant application process and a reporting requirement that, in turn, generated another set of documents that the ledger could reference in future reviews. In bureaucratic terms, This meant that prevention work increasingly tied into existing funding streams rather than remaining a one-off philanthropic experiment. The ledger also changed how death was ritualized. The funeral on November 2, 2024, remained a reference point, a pivot that people still named when making decisions about public acknowledgement. Since then, several funerals and anniversaries included a brief institutional statement when families requested it. Some families declined, others invited a neutral paragraph that acknowledged harm in general terms. These choices felt delicate. No one wanted to use a death to score a point. Yet families accepting a factual statement often reported relief that the record existed independently of private testimony.